I stood in my own living room with my hands cuffed behind my back, watching a paramedic wrap my mother's bleeding arm in a splint. My father sat on the sofa, jabbing a bruised finger toward me while giving a sworn statement to 2 patrol officers. He claimed that, when they'd asked me for a simple loan to help my younger brother, Kevin, I had flown into a psychotic rage and attacked them both with a steel fireplace poker. The officers looked at me with a disgust I felt in my teeth, already preparing to transport me to county jail on felony elder abuse and aggravated assault charges that carried a mandatory minimum of 10 years. My father leaned in close, lowering his voice so the cops couldn't hear. "Transfer the house deed to Kevin's name right now," he whispered. "Do it and we'll tell the cops we refuse to press charges. Refuse and you rot in a cell." They thought I was a cornered, terrified victim who would trade $1 million house for her freedom. They didn't know that 3 days ago, after noticing items missing from my safe, I had installed a 360-degree microfiche camera disguised as a smoke detector directly above the living room table. It streamed to a secure cloud server my brother didn't know existed and my parents had never thought to look for, because it never occurred to either of them that the daughter they'd spent a lifetime underestimating might, for once, be one step ahead. To explain how I ended up cuffed in my own home, I need to go back 4 months, to the week I signed the closing papers on the first thing I had ever built entirely for myself. I was 36 when I bought the house on Larkspur Hill, a low, sun-filled modern build I had designed myself over 11 months of late nights, back when I was still working 80-hour weeks trying to make junior partner at the architecture firm that now had my name on the door. It wasn't just a house. It was proof of every year I'd spent sleeping 4 hours a night in design school, every client I'd placated, every unpaid overtime hour I'd swallowed to build a reputation nobody handed me. I stood in the empty living room the day I got the keys and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry in years. Not from sadness, but from the specific, disorienting relief of finally, physically, owning something that couldn't be taken from me. I was wrong about that, I just didn't know it yet. My parents called 2 weeks after I moved in. My father's construction business had gone under the previous winter, a project financing deal that collapsed, though I'd later learn collapsed was generous. He'd simply mismanaged the numbers and refused on principle to admit it. My mother had never worked outside the home and had no independent income of her own. And Kevin, 29 and unemployed for the 3rd consecutive year, had just been evicted from an apartment he'd stopped paying rent on months earlier. Just for a little while, my mother said, her voice doing the particular trembling thing it always did when she wanted something and needed me to feel responsible for providing it. "Until your father gets back on his feet. A month, maybe 2. I said yes. I want to be honest about why I said yes because I think it matters to understanding everything that came after. I said yes out of guilt, the specific, well-worn guilt of an eldest daughter who had spent her whole life believing that success came with an invoice attached, payable to the people who raised her. I told myself a month or 2 was nothing. I told myself family helped family. I had, by that point, told myself a great many things that weren't true in order to keep loving people who had never quite loved me back at parity. The month became 2. The 2 became 4. What started as a spare bedroom and a temporary air mattress in the den became, gradually and then all at once, a full occupation. My father rearranged my garage without asking. My mother reorganized my kitchen to her own specifications, informing me when I objected that I clearly didn't know how a proper kitchen should be run. Kevin never looked for work. He slept until noon, ordered takeout on an account he'd somehow gotten access to my account. It turned out, when the statement arrived, and referred to my home office, unprompted and unashamed, as his gaming room. Within 2 months, I wasn't living in my own house anymore. I was maintaining it for other people, the way I imagine a groundskeeper maintains an estate whose owners no longer bother to learn his name. I paid the mortgage, the utilities, the groceries for 4 adults instead of 1. When Kevin racked up $11,000 in credit card debt buying equipment for a trading strategy he'd read about online and never actually executed, my mother informed me over dinner I had cooked that family helps family meant I would be covering it. I said no. It was the first time I'd said no to any of them in longer than I could remember. and the silence that followed told me immediately that I had broken some unspoken rule they'd all assumed I would never test. "You have the money," my father said, not looking up from his plate. "We don't, it's not complicated." "It's my money," I said, "I earned it." "And who do you think helped shape the person who earned it?" my mother said, and I felt, not for the first time, the particular vertigo of being reminded that in my family's accounting, my entire adult life was still somehow a debt owed rather than an achievement of my own. That was the night I stopped pretending this was temporary. I met with an attorney the following week, quietly, without telling any of them, because some instinct I didn't fully understand yet told me I would need documentation before I needed courage. Under the law, once occupants have lived in a residence for more than 30 days, they acquire tenancy rights, which meant that even in my own house, evicting my family required a formal legal process, a written notice, a specified cure period, and if they refused to leave voluntarily, a court filing. I had my attorney draft it properly. 30 days, clean, unambiguous, legally airtight. I served it to them on a Sunday evening. All three of them gathered in the living room I had designed with my own hands, the paper trembling slightly in my grip despite every rehearsal I'd done in the mirror that morning. My mother read it first, and her face went through several stages I will remember for the rest of my life: confusion, disbelief, and then something that settled disturbingly into pure calculation. "You're evicting your own parents," she said, not as a question. "I'm asking you to find your own place. I'll help you with the deposit. I'll help you move. But this isn't sustainable anymore, and it hasn't been for months." My father stood up slowly, the eviction notice still in my mother's hand, and looked at me with an expression I had never seen him direct at me before. Not anger exactly. Something colder. Something that looked unsettlingly like he was recalculating my value to him in real time and arriving at a much lower number. "We'll see about that," he said quietly and left the room. I didn't understand that night what those 4 words meant. I would understand within the week. They waited 11 days, long enough, I'd realize later, to plan every detail, to rehearse a performance so precise it would have fooled anyone, including, for several agonizing minutes, me. I came home from a site visit on a Thursday evening, exhausted, my mind still on load-bearing calculations for a client's renovation, and I registered the wrongness of my own living room before I understood what I was looking at. A vase I'd bought in Lisbon lay shattered across the hardwood. A dining chair was overturned, and in the middle of it, my mother was on the floor, her arm bent at an angle that made my stomach drop before any conscious thought caught up to the image. Screaming, actually screaming, a sound I had never once heard her make in 36 years. While my father knelt over her, his own face already darkening with what I would later understand was a bruise he had inflicted on himself, deliberately, methodically, in the 11 minutes between calling 911 and my arrival. "She hit me?" my mother was shrieking, pointing at me with her uninjured arm the instant I stepped through the door, before I had said a single word, before I had done anything at all except stand frozen in my own doorway trying to process a scene that made no sense. "She attacked us." "Oh God, my arm." "What is happening?" I started, and that was as far as I got before my father lunged toward me, not to attack, I understood later, but to perform an attack for an audience that hadn't arrived yet, grabbing my wrist hard enough to bruise it while positioning his own already bloodied face at an angle that would photograph well. The sirens arrived 4 minutes later. I know it was 4 minutes because I would later request the 911 timeline as part of my own defense, and I would read that number over and over. 4 minutes, trying to understand how efficiently, how completely, my own parents had turned my home into a crime scene in the time it took me to drive from a client site across town. The 2 responding officers walked into a living room staged with the precision of a film set, my mother sobbing into a paramedic's shoulder, her arm already swelling in a way that would later require an actual splint, whether or not the injury was self-inflicted. My father's face bloodied and already forming the dark, convincing bruise of a man who had, I would learn, smashed his own cheekbone into the corner of the coffee table with enough force to require 4 stitches. The steel fireplace poker lying conspicuously on the rug between us, close enough to me that the implication required no explanation at all. "She just came at us," my father said to the lead officer, his voice cracking with what sounded, to anyone who hadn't spent 36 years learning the difference between his real emotions and his performed ones, like genuine terror. We told her we needed a little help with her brother's debts, and she just snapped. She's been unstable for weeks, ever since she tried to throw us out. I stood in the middle of my own living room, surrounded by wreckage I hadn't caused, listening to my father describe an assault that had never happened with a fluency that told me, with a sick, plummeting certainty, that he had rehearsed this. That this was not a spontaneous act of desperation. This was a plan, built in advance, tested in front of a mirror the way I had tested my own eviction notice in front of one 11 days earlier. Except his plan had a body count of 1, and it was mine. "That's not," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to, thinner, already sounding to my own ears, exactly like the unstable woman my father had just described. "I just walked in. I don't know what happened here. I wasn't even in the house." "Ma'am, we're going to need you to stay calm," the officer said, and I watched in real time the specific and irreversible momentum of a situation already decided, his eyes moving between my mother's swelling arm, my father's bleeding face, and me. A woman standing untouched, unbruised, unbloodied in the middle of a room that looked like a crime had happened in it. A room that offered exactly one person as the obvious perpetrator, because I was the only one in it who wasn't visibly injured. I tried to explain. I tried 3 times, my voice climbing towards something that sounded, even to me, increasingly like panic, which I understood, even as it was happening, was the worst possible thing it could sound like. Panic looks like guilt to people trained to read a room in 90 seconds. Calm looks like guilt too, if you're a woman standing over 2 bleeding, sobbing elderly people. There was no version of my own voice, in that moment, that was going to sound like the truth, because the truth required context my parents had spent 11 days engineering me out of. "I need you to place your hands behind your back," the officer said, and I felt the cold metal close around my wrists with a finality that seemed to physically alter the air in the room. And somewhere behind me, so quiet I almost missed it beneath my mother's continued sobbing, I heard my father exhale, not in relief exactly, but in something closer to satisfaction. The specific exhale of a man watching a plan land exactly where he'd aimed it. "Felony elder abuse," the second officer was saying into his radio, reciting an address that was, absurdly, unbearably, my own address, on a street I had chosen in a house I had designed. "Aggravated assault, victims elderly, evidence of blunt force trauma consistent with the weapon on scene." I stood there, cuffed, in the wreckage of my own living room, and felt something in me go very quiet and very still. The particular stillness of a person's mind trying to locate solid ground in a situation constructed, deliberately, to have none. That was when my father approached me, ostensibly to speak to the officers again, and instead leaned close enough that only I could hear him, his bloodied face inches from mine, his voice dropping into something almost gentle, almost tender, the voice he might have used decades earlier to comfort a much younger version of me. "Transfer the house to Kevin," he whispered. "Sign it over tonight and we tell them it was a misunderstanding. We refuse to press charges, this all goes away and you get to keep your life. Fight us and I promise you, you will spend the next decade in a cell thinking about how this could have been so easy." I looked at him, at the calculated calm behind the fake bruising, at a man who had engineered his own daughter's arrest with the same cold competence he'd once brought to bidding construction contracts. And I understood, with a clarity that arrived like ice water, exactly what I was dealing with. Not a father who had lost control. A man who had built a business case, and I was the asset he intended to liquidate. I said nothing, not because I had no words, because I had, in that suspended, cuffed, wordless moment, remembered something that changed the entire shape of the room without a single person in it knowing it yet. 3 days earlier, after noticing my grandmother's antique brooch missing from my safe, a theft I'd quietly suspected Kevin of and never confronted him about, filing the knowledge away instead, I had installed a small, unobtrusive security measure of my own. A 360-degree fisheye lens disguised inside a smoke detector housing mounted directly above the living room table. Motion activated. Cloud sync. Invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. And none of them had ever once looked at me closely enough to imagine I might be capable of looking back. It had been running, silently, for the entire 20 minutes before I walked through my own front door. I let them think they'd won. It wasn't hard in the end to perform surrender. I had spent 36 years learning exactly what my collapse was supposed to look like to this family. And some cold, functioning part of my mind understood that the performance they wanted from me now was the same one they'd always wanted. The compliant daughter, defeated, grateful for whatever mercy they offered in place of the harm they'd caused. "Okay," I said quietly, my voice shaking, and I let it shake because shaking served me now. "Okay, I'll sign it over, just please don't let them take me. I'll do whatever you want." My father's face did something close to relief, close to triumph, and beside him my mother, still sniffling into a paramedic's shoulder, allowed herself the smallest, most fleeting satisfied glance in my direction. The kind of glance you give someone once you're certain they can no longer see you clearly enough to remember it. "See," my father said to the lead officer, his voice warming into something almost magnanimous. "She understands now. Officer, we don't want to press charges. This was a family misunderstanding. We just need a few minutes to sort out some paperwork and then we can put this whole thing behind us." The officer looked between us, visibly uneasy. I could see, even through my own fear, that some professional instinct in him was registering the strangeness of injured victims suddenly eager to drop charges the moment a deed transfer was mentioned, though he didn't yet have language for what that instinct was telling him. "You want to draft something now?" he asked, skeptical. "I need my phone," I said, keeping my voice small, careful, exactly as broken as they needed it to sound. "I need to call my attorney. He has the deed template. It's the first app on my phone. My hands are cuffed, I can't." The officer hesitated, glanced at his partner, and then, with the particular weary compliance of a man who wanted this domestic mess resolved as bloodlessly as possible, reached into my jacket pocket and retrieved my phone. "First app," I said. "It should already be open to the right screen. Can you cast it to the TV? It's easier for everyone to see the document at once." It was, in fact, not a document. It was a cloud streaming app, already logged in, already displaying a folder of footage timestamped from 20 minutes before the officer's arrival. I had built the request the only way I knew it would work, not as an accusation, which they would have every reason to refuse, but as a mundane administrative task, a woman defeated and compliant, simply trying to get paperwork sorted so this could all be over. The officer, mildly irritated, mildly curious, cast the screen to the 75-inch television mounted above my own fireplace. The fireplace whose steel poker was still lying on the rug 6 feet from where I stood. The footage began to play. It showed my father, calm and unhurried, walking into frame 22 minutes earlier. It showed him picking up the fireplace poker with both hands, checking its weight the way a man checks a tool before using it. It showed him speaking to my mother, the audio, crisp and unmistakable, capturing his exact words with a clarity none of us could later dispute. "Brace your arm, just like we practiced. Don't flinch, it'll look worse if you flinch." It showed my mother extending her arm across the coffee table, her expression tight with anticipated pain but not notably with any fear of me, because I wasn't in the room, because I hadn't arrived yet, because there was no possible version of this footage in which I was anywhere near that house. It showed my father striking her arm with the poker once with a precision that suggested rehearsal, and my mother's scream, the same scream I'd heard through my own front door 20 minutes later, except now I could hear its true origin, deliberate, timed, produced. It showed my father setting the poker down carefully on the rug, exactly where it would later be found. It showed him walking to the coffee table, bracing himself, and driving his own face into its edge with a controlled, practiced force once, twice, until blood appeared. It showed him checking his reflection in his phone's dark screen, adjusting the angle of the bruise forming on his cheekbone, before he picked up the shattered vase pieces and scattered them across the floor in a pattern that would read, to any responding officer, as evidence of a struggle. And it showed, in the final 90 seconds before I walked through my own front door, my father saying to my mother, with the flat satisfaction of a man closing a business deal, "Once she's cuffed, I offer her the deed swap. She won't fight it. She never fights anything. By tonight, this house belongs to Kevin and we never have to worry about money again." The living room went silent in a way I felt in my chest. The paramedic, still crouched beside my mother's now visibly self-inflicted injury, slowly stood and stepped back, her expression shifting from professional concern into something closer to horror. The lead officer's face, which had held nothing but disgust for me 20 minutes earlier, underwent a transformation so total it seemed to age him. Disgust rearranging itself, feature by feature, into a fury I understood he was directing, finally, entirely, at the two people who deserved. "Turn it off," my father said, his voice cracking for the first time that night, though not, I understood, from remorse. From the specific panic of a man watching his own plan detonate in front of the exact audience he'd built it for. Nobody turned it off. The officer reached behind me instead, and I felt the cuffs release from my wrists with a mechanical click that I will remember, I think, for the rest of my life, the precise physical sensation of a nightmare reversing direction. "Ma'am, I apologize," he said, and I could hear how much the apology cost a man who had, 20 minutes earlier, been fully prepared to take me to county jail on his own certainty. "We're going to need a full statement from you, and I need backup here immediately." He was already reaching for his radio. What happened next moved with a speed that felt, after the suspended horror of the previous half hour, almost disorienting. 2 additional patrol cars arriving within minutes. A supervising sergeant walking the footage back frame by frame on my television, while my father attempted, with rapidly diminishing conviction, to argue that the video had been taken out of context. A defense so absurd against footage of him coaching my mother through her own injury that even his own attorney, reached by phone 40 minutes later, would reportedly tell him to stop talking. Kevin arrived at the house at 8:40, 20 minutes after the second wave of officers, walking in with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man expecting to sign paperwork for a house that was about to become his. He made it 3 steps past the threshold before an officer intercepted him, and I watched. From the kitchen where I sat wrapped in a blanket, a different paramedic had draped over my shoulders. As understanding arrived on his face in slow, humiliating stages, first confusion, then a fast panic scan of the room for our parents, then the particular color drain of a man realizing the conspiracy he'd agreed to profit from had just been recorded in high definition. "I didn't do anything," he said, backing toward the door as an officer moved to block it. "I wasn't even here for the, I just came to sign." "Sir, we have audio of your parents discussing transferring this property to you as the direct outcome of a staged assault and false police report," the sergeant said, not unkindly, simply factually. "That makes you a named beneficiary of a documented extortion conspiracy. You'll need to come with us." He didn't fight it. I think in the end, none of them fought it, not really. My father's protests grew quieter with every replay of the footage. My mother stopped speaking entirely somewhere around the 3rd viewing, staring instead at the poker on the rug as though she could no longer quite understand how it had gotten there, how any of it had gotten here, how a plan built with such confidence had produced, instead of a house, a set of felony charges each of them would spend years being unable to undo. I gave my formal statement that night, sitting at my own kitchen island with a detective I'd never met, watching the cloud footage play a second time, then a third, my voice steady in a way that surprised me, the particular flat calm of a person who has already done the hardest part of surviving something and is now simply methodically documenting it. I told them about the eviction notice, about the 11 days of silence that followed it, about the camera I'd installed after noticing the missing brooch, a decision made out of quiet suspicion rather than any premonition of what it would ultimately save me from. "You understand," the detective said near the end, "that if you hadn't had that footage, we would have processed this exactly the way it was staged to be processed. The physical evidence alone, their injuries, the weapon, their synchronized statements, that's a case most juries convict on. You'd have been arraigned by morning." I understood. I had understood it, somewhere in the cold, functioning part of my mind, the entire time I was cuffed in my own living room, watching my father whisper his deed transfer ultimatum into my ear like a man closing on a piece of property he'd already decided was his. My parents were charged with conspiracy to commit extortion, filing a false police report, and once the full scope of my father's self-inflicted injuries was medically confirmed, insurance and evidence fraud, given that he'd initially attempted to file a homeowner's liability claim against me before the footage surfaced. Kevin's charges were lesser but still severe. Conspiracy and attempted extortion enough, his attorney told him privately, to make a plea deal his only realistic option. I attended none of the hearings that followed except the one where the judge, reviewing the footage himself before sentencing, remarked, in words that made it into a local news brief I read once and never sought out again, that he had rarely seen a case where the intended victim's own preparation had so completely and immediately inverted the outcome the perpetrators had engineered. My parents received 4 years each. Kevin, whose involvement had been more opportunistic than architected, received 18 months and a restitution order. I changed the locks the following morning, though there was no longer anyone with a key who could use it against me. I had the living room repainted a month later, not because anything remained of that night physically, but because I wanted to walk into that room and feel, finally, that it belonged entirely to the life I was building rather than the one I'd spent 36 years apologizing for. I still keep the smoke detector. Not the original, that one is sealed in an evidence locker somewhere, permanently, as it should be, but a new one in the same spot, doing exactly what a smoke detector is supposed to do, nothing more. Some nights I sit in that living room with a cup of tea and think about how close I came to losing everything to 2 people who raised me, and then, when raising me stopped being profitable, tried to price me out of my own life. I don't spend much time on forgiveness. I've come to understand that forgiveness was never actually the debt they were owed. The house is quiet now. Every room in it is mine, in the way rooms are only ever truly yours once no one is left inside them who believes they have a claim on you instead.